I'm going to introduce David Hart in a very indirect and brief manner. Can Professor Hoppe please come to the stage? We're very honoured to have Professor Hoppe here, and I know he has faith that some of us might write something worthwhile in his tradition, but I think I think it's unlikely we'll live up to his example. So here's a bottle of wine and a Rothbard tie. And that's on behalf of the organising committee, Michael, Sukrit, Washington, Bulukani, and Samuel, who all equally importantly contributed to this event. And I don't want Hoppe to respond to this, but when I told Professor Hoppe that David Hart was speaking, he immediately told me that he has memories of Rothbard praising Dr. Hart. So I thought you would just repeat what you heard from Rothbard about Dr. Hart.
When I met Murray Rothbard in 1985, I was familiar with his work, but I did not know him personally. And the first things that we did was going over the names of the libertarian movement. Murray Rothbard always described that the libertarian movement started in his living room and that he could count all of them. And one of the persons that he always mentioned as one of the great talents of the libertarian movement was a guy that I had never heard of, David Hart. Then immediately I found out that he had written a number of articles in the Journal of Libertarian Studies. And Murray at that time expressed a certain amount of sadness that David Hart had somehow disappeared from the scene. And I was relieved, so to speak, to find that he has not disappeared from the scene, that he is here. My expectation was that David Hart would be much older than I was, because when I came to the United States, of course, I felt that I was a young man and there was already an accomplished guy, David Hart. And when people told me David Hart is actually 7 years younger than I am, I was simply stunned.
Thank you for those very kind words. I went to Stanford in 1981 and left in 1983. And when I got a chance to meet Murray Rothbard and Leonard Liggio, who was an important mentor for me in learning about the history of the French classical liberal tradition. And one reason I left Stanford was I was thrown out of the university because I had irreconcilable differences with the staff over what I would write my PhD on and who would supervise me. And that's why I went to Cambridge. I found not a more welcoming place to work, but one that at least tolerated me, whereas Stanford didn't. So that's why I disappeared off the face of the earth. I want to talk to you about a relatively unknown branch of the classical liberal family, namely the French classical liberals, in particular a group within that school of thought who I call the radical free market classical liberals. And I'll talk a little bit about them in a moment. And I want to bring them to your attention because they're of their intrinsic worth and interest, but they're also, I think, important because they influenced the modern Austrian school, in particular through the work of Leonard Liggio and Ralph Raico, who I think introduced Rothbard to some of the more radical French liberals, and that's how he became acquainted with their ideas and began to incorporate some of their ideas into his own economic and social theory. So here I've got a panel of images of some of the leading figures, left and right, the French, and the central column of the stars of the modern Austrian movement. I want to recite to you a poem, and I'm very glad that Viv Forbes mentioned the importance of other aspects of the classical liberal tradition apart from pure economic theory and social theory. That we also need to have a strong culture of music and art and film in which liberal ideas are expressed. And this is my very crude attempt to write a song that I think Mises would have sung had he been a Beatles fan. And this is based on the Beatles song Let It Be. And one very natural translation or equivalent of Let It Be is laissez-faire, as the French for let it be, allow things to be free. So this is my crude attempt at a musical tribute to both Mises and the Beatles. And this song is Let It Be, laissez-faire. I won't sing it because that would be very embarrassing, and I'll spare myself that embarrassment. When I find myself in times of trouble, Ludwig Mises comes to me, speaking words of wisdom, laissez-faire. And in my hour of darkness, he is standing right in front of me, speaking words of wisdom, laissez-faire. Laissez-faire, 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 whisper words of wisdom, laissez-faire. And when the regulated people living in the world agree, there will be an answer, laissez-faire. For though they may be ruined, there is still a chance that they'll be free. There will be an answer, laissez-faire. So that's mine. If you go to my website, you can also find my limericks about Frédéric Bastiat. And Bastiat is actually quite a hard name to rhyme with. One of the things that attracts me to the French classical liberal tradition is the richness, both in its economic theory, its social theory, that is, writing of history and of sociology, and also culture. And this is one of my favourite French classical liberal authors, a guy by the name of Pierre-Jean de Béranger. And you have to remember that in the 1830s, there were severe restrictions on organised political movements. You couldn't form parties, you couldn't criticise the government. And so what the French did, being Frenchmen, they would have drinking societies. And they would gather together in these clubs, which were de facto political groups. And they would sing satirical songs mocking the government and government policy in the hope that the police would not come and close them down. And Béranger was a best-selling author of these songs, which were sung in these clubs. And he was a member of the Society of Political Economy, would you believe, in the 1840s. So he mixed with the circles of Bastiat and Molinari and attended their regular dinners. And now this is a song that was sung in praise of smuggling, which is very interesting. And the refrain goes like this. And this is a picture from one of the illustrated volumes of his collected works, which were published just on the eve of the French Revolution in 1848. And the refrain goes, "Hang the excisemen, let us get hold of pleasures in plenty and heaps of gold. We have the people on our side, they're all our friends at heart. Yes, lads, the people far and wide, the people take our part." And this is one of the verses. What 'tis their will that where one tongue is spoken, where the same laws long time have been obeyed, because some treaty may such bonds have broken, two hostile nations should forsooth be made. So he's saying that artificial borders are caused by governments, breaking apart people who share the same language and culture and have traded for years and years. So free trade or smuggling is just another form of free trade across these artificial national boundaries. And I won't go any further because I won't have time, but this is the sort of the cultural side of the French classical liberal movement, which I think is very interesting and which to some degree is missing from the modern libertarian movement. We do not have the same degree of influence on popular culture that the French liberals had in their day, in the 1840s and so on. And it's interesting to think how we might expand our reach, to continue to develop our economic theories, our social theories, but also to influence the way in which people who create works of art might come to share our views and express some of those values in their creative work. But I'll come to that again at the end of my talk. Something that I want to just talk about briefly is why the French classical liberal is important, what makes the Austrian school Austrian. That's a very interesting question. And what makes the French classical liberal school Austrian? I think there are many Austrian aspects of the liberalism that developed in France in the 1830s and 40s. And I would like to just explore some of those very briefly today. A couple of websites that you might want to look at. This is my own personal website, davidmhart.com, where I have a lot of material about the French classical liberal tradition. I have also a lot of work on art and the politics of art, which you can, if you're interested in what I've said today, you might want to follow some of those up. I'm the director of the online Library of Liberty project for Liberty Fund, and we have over 1,000 books in the classical liberal and free market tradition online, free of charge, fully searchable, and we have a sizable Austrian collection. We're in the process of publishing our own version of the complete works of Ludwig von Mises. And they're also available on this Portable Library of Liberty DVD. This is a data DVD with over 1,000 texts in PDF, EPUB, and Kindle. And we give these away for free. I've given away 25,000 of them so far. If you want one, please contact me via the website, and we will send you one gratis. My current research interests are involved in a big project at Liberty Fund in translating the complete works of Frédéric Bastiat, and the first volume of that has come out earlier this year, and volume 2 is in production right now. This is the list of volumes. There'll be 6 very large volumes, about 3,000 pages, 500 per volume, and I'm the academic editor of that project. Now, as I have said briefly before, I think we need to have a very robust defence of individual liberty, and this robustness comes from a combination of strong economic theory that's consistent and radical, and we've heard Hans-Hermann Hoppe give his very robust and rigorous defence of that. We also need a broader social theory, and it's interesting that the masters of the Austrian school, like Mises and Rothbard, were also very keen historians. They wanted to apply their economic and political insights into the writing of a broader social theory, particularly Rothbard with his works of history and class analysis. But Mises also wrote about history and theory, and wrote a very interesting number of books about fascism and Nazism in World War II. And I think we also need a third component, which is this cultural dimension. And what I find interesting is that of all the 3 sort of major classical liberal movements, the English classical liberals of the 19th century, the French classical liberals and the Austrians, it's the French school which has been ignored and is least known. And I think that's something that we need to remedy because of some of the things that I've already mentioned, and I'll give you some more details in a moment. The French liberal school, I think, has been unfortunately neglected, even though it is of considerable worth. It's more radical and more consistent than the English school. For example, the English school got mired in utilitarianism, whereas the French classical liberals remained basically adherents of natural law and natural rights, and that gave them a harder cutting edge in their criticism of the state. They are also far more developed in their work on social theory, especially history, and using class analysis to look at the origins of the French state in the medieval period, and also the way in which Napoleon and the French Revolution had created a new bureaucratic class which had come to power in France, and that was something that they were trying to explore. What's also interesting is the French shared a number of interesting economic insights with what became known as the Austrian school, and did so in the 1840s, well ahead of the marginal revolution in the 1870s. But unfortunately, because of early deaths, for example, Bastiat died of throat cancer, I think, in 1850, and a number of his colleagues also died too young in the early 1850s. The promise of this sort of proto-Austrian analysis of economics sort of began to diminish. And this was after a promising start. I'd also, as I mentioned before, think it's important to study the French because of the influence that they had on writers like Rothbard through Leonard Liggio's interest in the French classical liberal school. Here's a list of some of the key French classical liberals I've come across, which I think are noteworthy. I've divided them into generations. The first generation, someone like Jean-Baptiste Say, he wrote his treatise in 1803, and he developed a particularly unique version of classical liberal political economy, which was a very interesting combination of history, sociology, and economic insight, and he made some important breakthroughs in his analysis of key figures or players in the free market economy like entrepreneurs. It's most unfortunate but also quite amusing that in the first translation of his work into English, entrepreneur was translated as undertaker, which was not helpful, I don't think. Following Jean-Baptiste Say came a couple of lawyers, Charles Comte and Charles Dunoyer, who took Say's ideas and began to ask themselves, how is it that societies evolve and evolve in the direction of freedom. And they began to develop interesting theories of historical development that went through economic stages. So this is like Marxism before Marx. Right? They argued that societies went through various stages like slavery and feudalism and mercantilism and then sort of Napoleonic bureaucratism, and that we were now emerging into a period of commerce and industry, where these would be the predominant forces and which would allow greater economic activity and greater freedom to gradually emerge. And Comte and Dunoyer based their sociological and historical analysis very deeply on Jean-Baptiste Say's economic writings. And then we have the historian Augustin Thierry, who is one of the extremely important historians to apply these classical liberal notions to the writing of particularly medieval history. The second generation who come after Say and Comte and Dunoyer are the period is a group of men who I think really pushed the limits of French classical liberal thinking in completely new directions, in sort of Austrian directions. And this group is one of the leading figures is Frédéric Bastiat, another younger man called Charles Coquelin, Jean-Gustave Courcelles-Senoy, very little known economist, and then Gustave de Molinari. And what's interesting that this is a clustering of figures who came together in the 1840s. And I describe the 1840s as a kind of anarcho-capitalist moment in history, where a number of thinkers began to think the unthinkable, beginning with someone like Molinari in 1846 and then in 1849. He says, what if we apply economic analysis to everything, even what the government does? What if we look at all kinds of monopoly in a critical fashion, including the government provision of security? Just by asking this question, he invites all sorts of radical conclusions. And he came to the conclusion that everything can be analysed in economic terms. All monopolies are bad, whether they be government or private, and that economists should now begin to think about how these previously monopolised institutions or activities could be done privately. And he comes up with the notion of insurance companies offering their services for protection on an open competitive market and trying to envisage what sorts of solutions would emerge from this free market in the production of security. And he invents that expression in a famous essay. We also have another sort of Austrian or anarcho-capitalist moment with the author Charles Coquelin. Here's another one who dies far too early, 1852. He, in 1846 and 1848, begins to think about the policy of free banking. Again, another government institution that might be exposed to competition, to free entry of competitors, offering free market currency, which would be the value of which and the widespread use of which would be determined by purely competitive forces. Now, all of this is happening between 1846 and 1856. So it's a very interesting historical question, is why is this happening now? And I think it's partly because of the terrifying rise of socialism in France in the 1840s, the radicalisation of the political economists in France by the 1848 revolution and the first experiments in creating a welfare state with a program like the National Workshops, which was a government program to have unemployment insurance. And Bastiat fought this bitterly when he was the vice president of the financial committee of the Constituent Assembly, to which he was elected. So all these things come together in a very rich and interesting way in this 10-year period. And then they get dispersed through early deaths. Molinari is forced to flee to Belgium because of the rise to power of the dictator Napoleon III, who doesn't like this radical wing of the free market group. So this is a sort of a flourishing that doesn't quite see fruition. And it took another 100 or so years before people like Rothbard began to pick up some of these ideas and develop them further. These are some of the key texts from this incredible period of between 1846 and 1856. But if you ask yourself, exactly how Austrian were this radical group within the French political economy movement, and you have to remember that they were a faction within a larger group. Not all the French economists were as radical as Molinari and Coquelin and others, but they were a very vocal and they were a very innovative and very creative group of people within this broader movement. And if you look through a checklist of what ideas sort of define what modern Austrianism is, I looked at Peter Boettke's article in the Concise Encyclopedia of Economics to come up with a number of this checklist here. The science of economics, he says Austrians believe that only individuals choose. The study of the market order is fundamentally about exchange behaviour and institutions within which exchanges take place. Proposition 3, the facts of the social sciences are what people believe and think. In microeconomics, utility and costs are subjective. The price system is a way of transferring information about supply and demand and so on. Private property in the means of production is a necessary condition for rational economic calculation. The competitive market is a process of entrepreneurial discovery. And then in macroeconomics, money is not neutral, right? It has political consequences and economic consequences. The capital structure consists of heterogeneous goods that have multi-specific uses that must be aligned. And Proposition 10, social institutions often are the result of human action and not of human design. And if you go through the French classical liberals, you can ask yourself, how many of these ideas or concepts were they exploring, or had they come up with, or had they never heard of? And this is my attempt to try and come up with a sort of scorecard of how Austrian were these French economists. With this notion about only individuals choose, this is very strongly advocated by these French liberals, right? They are finally focused on individual activity as property owners, as traders, as entrepreneurs. That is their focus. Proposition 2, the study of the market order is fundamentally about exchange behaviour. For Bastiat, that was the most important thing, exchanges between consenting adults. What they did not come up with was Proposition 3, the facts of the social sciences are what people believe and think. This was the radical aspect of subjectivism which comes from the 1870s, the marginal revolution. So the scorecard out of the science of economics is 2 out of 3 the French liberals were exploring. In microeconomics, Proposition 4, utility and cost is subjective. This is quite strongly supported by people like Bastiat in particular, and he was increasingly moving in this direction, seeing that all exchanges are really exchanges of service for service, which is his, I think, groping towards this idea of subjective costs and individual subjective cost. The price system economises information. They sort of half came to that conclusion, but they did not see or recognise the role of prices as transmitters of information, which was one of Hayek's great inventions. Proposition 6, that private property and the means of production is a necessary condition for rational economic calculation. I would say half they agree with this. The French school recognised very strongly the importance of private property, but not as a way of rational economic calculation. That was not a concept that they had developed at that time. The competitive market is a process of entrepreneurial discovery. Again, half yes. Based in the Say tradition, they were very sensitive to the role of the entrepreneur, but did not understand his role as a way of inaugurating a process of discovery. So in this group of 4, I say that the French got 2.5 out of 4 in terms of how Austrian they were. In macroeconomics, money is non-neutral. This is definitely part of their agenda. Coquelin in particular and other advocates of free banking recognised that banking had become politicised by being monopolised by the state. Proposition 9, capital structure, they had no idea about capital structure. Right? That was beyond them. Proposition 10, social institutions are often the result of human action but not of human design. And I would say they were very strong advocates of this view. They understood exactly what the free market did and the natural harmony of economic activity. It was very crucial to their version of this idea. So I give them an overall score of 6 out of 10. 4 out of 10, they largely agreed or shared Austrian insights. 4 out of 10 partly agreed or had just certain similar solutions to the problem. So I like to use a unit of measurement, and if you use utils as a measure of utility, as some economists do, I want to have a unit of measurement called the Austro. And I would say that the French economists just over half an Austro, 6 out of 10. That would be my ranking of how Austrian the French were. In terms of social theory, that's, I think, one of the great strengths of the French classical liberal school, say, compared to the English classical school of political economy. The richness of their history writing and their sort of beginnings of sociological analysis, where they look at class analysis and the structure of the state and the various vested interests who come to control the state and how they behave. They're particularly interested in, as I said, Napoleonic bureaucratisation and how bureaucrats get vested interests and selfish interests. In that sense, they're not just Austrian, but they're also proto-public choice, which is very interesting. So they had an idea of exploitation, they have an idea of the theory of history, and these are things that modern Austrian economists, particularly Mises and Rothbard, also shared. So I would argue that the French classical school do share these other aspects, not just in economics, but in the development of social theory. And I have another checklist here, but I think I'm running out of time, so I won't go through this very strongly, except to say that I have another score here. Overall score, 5 out of 6, so they're sort of more Austrian in the broader social theory and history and sociology than they are in pure economic theory. So I give them a score of 5 out of 6, or nearly a full Austro, if we want to use my measurement. But where the French liberals really excel, I think, is not just combining economic and sociological analysis, but also the impact that they had on the broader French culture. And if I would have any criticism of the modern Austrian school, is this is an area which has been relatively neglected. And I think, unfortunately, so. This is just a brief sampling of some of the rich cultural responses that people who had classical liberal ideas, drawing upon these ideas and then expressing it in artistic ways. Now, this is one of my favourite paintings, not just because she's bare-breasted, although that's always an attractive feature. But this is Eugene Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People at the Barricade of 1830. So this is a painting celebrating a revolution that throughout the Bourbon monarchs and introduced what they hope would be a new constitutional monarchy in 1830. And we see, again, people being shot, having fallen at the barricade, and liberty rallying the French people for another assault on tyranny. And Delacroix is, in fact, had many friends who were classical liberals and shared some of their views and expressed them in paintings like this. But Delacroix also was a cartoonist, and this one of the things that really stimulated the French classical liberal tradition was policy of censorship in the restored monarchy after the fall of Napoleon in 1815. There was very heavy press censorship, and classical liberals, including artists like Delacroix, would draw these extremely funny and clever cartoons, mocking the censors. This one is called The Censor's Moving House, or The Censors Sent Packing. And we see in the top left-hand corner the building in which the censors live, and there's celebration by the people that the censors have been thrown out. They've been put on a cart. The cart is being driven by this moth-eaten looking donkey, and the devil is taking them all to hell in this wagon. And you can see the little winged creatures. They're actually pairs of scissors, which the censors used to cut out the offensive passages in a book, and they're all taking flight and they're going off into away from the censor's office. And it was this very interesting tradition of political cartooning which attracts my attention, and I'm very interested in pursuing this. Now, here's one of my favourite authors. He's, again, is a classical liberal, and by the name of Honoré Daumier, and he was actually sent to prison for some months for doing this. Louis-Philippe had the unfortunate physical characteristic of looking like a pear. His physical shape was pear-like, which of course meant that the cartoonists would draw him as a pear, and he would ban this, which only stimulated them to do more cartoons of him looking like a pear. And this is Daumier's image of the state as a tax eater. So clear understanding of how the state functions as a predatory, parasitic organism. And for many people, governments were seen at this period as being tax eaters. And this is Daumier's attempt to literally show this. So we have a group of people in the right-hand corner who are ordinary peasants, producers, farmers, whatever, and they're being forced to pay their taxes, and they have come to this tax collection point, and there are these government flunkies with wicker baskets. People put their gold coins, silver coins into the baskets, and the baskets are carried up into the mouth of Louis Philippe. And he's not just sitting on a chair, he's sitting on a commode, which I think is the polite French expression for a toilet. And so what goes in has to come out, and what comes out at the bottom of the commode are benefits and subsidies and privileges. And there's a group of people collecting all these products of the monarchical digestion and running off to the Chamber of Deputies to celebrate their... Now, as I said, Daumier was put in prison for this, which didn't stop him from drawing Louis Philippe in this way in the future. I've already told you about Béranger. He was mixed in political economy circles. He was part of the dinner club group that met every month. He knew Molinari and Bastiat and wrote some wonderful, wonderful songs and poems. When we compare the successes of the French in this cultural dimension and compare that with the Austrian and the free market school, I think we've got some catching up to do. And the examples that I could think of here was the penetration of our culture by free market ideas is I think, less satisfactory. I was thinking of the novels of Ayn Rand. They were very successful, and many of us began our intellectual journey because of her ideas. The film that was released this year, I don't know whether you've seen it, but I describe it as B grade across the board. That's about the best I can say about it. A much more successful and sophisticated and clever sort of cultural product with free market ideas is my favourite TV series, Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, which is every episode was like a lesson in public choice economics. And how that became made and how the BBC came to show it is just mind-boggling. I just don't understand why they would do that, since it was an attack on their very existence. Then, of course, we've had, in recent times, the success of Russell Roberts' Hayek rap videos that have done very well on YouTube, which is a very interesting attempt to try and get Austrian ideas out into a broader public in a fashion that will be appealing to younger people. But where is our Austrian cartoonist like Daumier? We don't have one. I mean, occasionally you find cartoonists who come up with Austrian insights, but very rarely. This is a picture of Atlas Shrugged. I think he's embarrassed and is just hiding his face from the movie. That's Yes Prime Minister, the image from the rap video. This is, if Bastiat had been a cartoonist, this is the cartoon he would have drawn. Right, here we have a cartoon of Barack Obama creating jobs, right? He's knitting a sweater which has got the word jobs on it, and he's knitting away, and the sweater is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. More and more jobs are being created. Right, this is the scene. Bastiat's famous story about the seen and the unseen. But where does this come from? Right? It has to come from the private sector. Right? A guy wearing a private sector sweater is having his sweater unravelled by this. And so that's what you don't see. You don't see the payments and suffering of people who have to pay the taxes. This is what the cartoon looked like when it was put together. So if Bastiat had been a cartoonist, this is what he would have done. But we don't have very many free market, certainly Austrian cartoonists who might do that. So my conclusion is that I think to have a radical or a robust theory of defence of liberty, we need to have three things. We need to have a rigorous and radical economic theory. We need to have a broader social theory of history and sociology. We also need to have a cultural representation of these ideas to appeal to a broader public. But we also need it to keep our own spirits up. And I think that's something that Ron and Viv were stressing as well, that we need to mock the government and the bearers of government power, to expose them for what they are and to have some fun in doing so. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.